There comes a time in the journey of a nation when silence is no longer weakness, and achievement speaks louder than 1,000 headlines. In the vastness of space where few have dared to reach, one nation, once colonized, once mocked, rose beyond Earth's limits to carve its name among the stars. Chandrayaan 3, a mission born not of arrogance but of quiet resolve. While critics whispered and old powers scoffed, India's answer wasn't with words, it was with action. And that action shook the very narrative of those who once sought to define it. This isn't just about landing on the moon. It's about reclaiming the narrative, a cosmic reply to centuries of doubt. And now, the world watches in awe, while the British media is left with nothing but silence. This is that story. Would you like a mid-speech monologue or closing lines in Morgan Freeman style too? Chandrayaan 3's lunar success rewrites global narratives. India's space triumph silences colonial-era skepticism. British media caught off guard by ISRO's precision. A scientific milestone becomes a national statement, from being ruled to ruling the moon. Poetic justice. Chandrayaan 3's lunar success stands as a monumental chapter in not only India's scientific journey, but in the broader narrative of global space exploration. For decades, space was seen as the exclusive domain of elite powers, countries with deep pockets, historical dominance, and loud media machines that shaped the perception of progress. Yet, quietly and methodically, India worked behind the scenes, away from the noise, perfecting its systems, learning from setbacks, and dreaming with purpose. When Chandrayaan 3 softly landed on the moon's south pole, a region no other country had ever reached, it wasn't just a technological feat. It was a recalibration of where innovation lives and whose voices deserve to be heard. The mission redefined expectation. With a fraction of the budget that Western nations typically allocate for lunar expeditions, India achieved a result that rivaled, even surpassed, their efforts in critical ways. This was not just engineering excellence, it was a demonstration of value-driven innovation, where necessity drove brilliance. For years, India was typecast in international narratives as a developing country still grappling with its challenges, not as a spacefaring giant capable of making history on a global scale. Chandrayaan 3 shattered that lens. While much of the mainstream Western media initially downplayed or ignored the mission, the moment of success could no longer be contained. Footage of the mission's control room, the joy of Indian scientists, and the pride of 1 billion citizens flooded the internet and forced a shift in tone. What was once quiet confidence became undeniable proof. This was not just a mission for science, it was a statement that India belongs at the table of modern superpowers, not merely as a guest, but as a leader. Chandrayaan 3 proved that ambition is not measured by noise but by results. It challenged outdated hierarchies that often placed countries in boxes based on legacy rather than merit. India did not seek to dominate space for power. It ventured forth with curiosity, determination, and humility, traits that were perhaps underestimated by traditional powers. And in doing so, it quietly destroyed the illusions that only certain nations could define progress. This success did more than land a spacecraft, it landed a new worldview. It told a new generation across the globe, especially in the global south, that the boundaries of possibility are not decided by history, but by vision. As India's tricolor flag was digitally etched onto the moon's surface through this achievement, it wasn't just science at work. It was identity, pride, and purpose coming together in a defining moment. The mission's success didn't need loud proclamation. The moon bore witness, and the world had no choice but to look up. India's success with Chandrayaan 3 is far more than a scientific victory. It is a profound symbolic moment that reverberates through centuries of colonial history and deeply entrenched skepticism. For too long, the world, particularly former colonial powers, have viewed India through a lens shaped by outdated narratives, ones that portrayed the nation as a place of poverty, chaos, and dependence. These narratives, deeply rooted in the colonial era, often painted India as incapable of standing on equal footing with the global elite. But with a single calculated and precise lunar landing, India didn't just reach the moon. It broke through those narratives and silenced the doubt that once echoed across oceans. This mission is a reminder that progress isn't handed down by history. It's forged in the present, by people who refuse to be defined by what once was. When British media outlets dismissed or downplayed India's ambitions, when analysts scoffed at the idea of a budget space mission achieving real success, they weren't just criticizing a program, they were underestimating an entire nation. Chandrayaan-3 is the ultimate rebuttal, delivered not through confrontation but through achievement. And in doing so, India turned centuries of condescension on its head. There is a quiet power in proving yourself through results, not rhetoric. The colonial mindset thrived on the belief that certain nations were inherently superior, scientifically, politically, culturally. Yet the precise landing of an Indian spacecraft on the moon's southern pole, a feat never accomplished by any other nation, was a moment that demanded global recognition, even from those who were once dismissive. It forced a re-evaluation of who leads, who innovates, and who deserves a voice in shaping the future. Chandrayaan-3 is more than a scientific mission, it's a cultural reset. It tells the story of a nation that endured occupation, exploitation, and systematic belittlement for over 2 centuries, rising not with vengeance, but with vision. India's path was never about trying to imitate the West. It was about creating its own model of excellence, one rooted in resourcefulness, resilience, and intelligence. And with this mission, India has shown that modern leadership doesn't need to be loud or extravagant. It needs to be focused, determined, and grounded in purpose. The silence from critics after the mission's success was louder than their earlier doubt, because deep down, many knew that this was a turning point, not just for India but for the world. A new balance of intellectual power is emerging, one where nations once overlooked are now setting the pace. The colonial era left behind scars and stereotypes, but Chandrayaan-3 is a sign that those scars are being transformed into symbols of strength. In the shadow of a colonial past, India has reached toward the stars and found not just the moon, but its rightful place in the story of human achievement. When India's Chandrayaan-3 made its historic landing on the moon's south pole, the scientific world stood still in admiration. But one sector that struggled to find its voice in that moment was the British media. For decades, certain outlets in the UK have been quick to mock, criticize, or downplay India's technological progress, often choosing to highlight poverty or political issues, while ignoring the country's substantial contributions to science, innovation, and global development. The success of Chandrayaan-3 disrupted this narrative entirely. It wasn't just a space victory, it was a public relations earthquake that left parts of the British media scrambling to respond. What unfolded was not a direct confrontation, but something far more impactful: quiet, undeniable excellence. India didn't issue bold statements or seek validation from the West. It simply launched, landed, and let the achievement speak for itself. For media outlets that were used to portraying India as a country struggling to find its footing, this success left little room for their usual tone of skepticism. How do you criticize the first nation to land on the lunar South Pole? How do you belittle a mission that cost significantly less than Western equivalents, and yet delivered groundbreaking results? This sudden and unignorable success left traditional critics exposed. Their silence, awkward headlines, and lack of enthusiasm said more than their past words ever could. It revealed a discomfort with shifting global dynamics, a world where developing nations no longer follow. The British media, in particular, was faced with a paradox: continue their old pattern of minimizing India's accomplishments and risk being viewed as out of touch, or acknowledge a victory that contradicted their long-held biases. Many chose caution. Coverage was minimal, muted, and in some cases, noticeably begrudging. While other international outlets praised India's historic feat, British headlines often focused more on the mission's cost or questioned why a country with social challenges would invest in space. But these responses only reinforced the outdated framework through which success is sometimes measured in the West. Chandrayaan-3 wasn't about proving India's wealth, it was about proving its will, intellect, and precision. It was about placing India among the elite, without needing their permission to be there. The contrast between action and reaction was stark. Indian scientists celebrated with humility. Citizens across the nation erupted with joy. The world's space agencies congratulated ISRO. Meanwhile,
The British media's subdued reaction highlighted an underlying discomfort, perhaps with a former colony surpassing expectations, or with the realization that innovation is no longer centralized in Western capital.
Chandrayaan-3 is not just a victory in lunar science, it is a mirror held up to those who doubted, minimized, or ignored. It reflects a truth that cannot be spun by headlines or buried under opinion columns. India is not just arriving, it has arrived, and those who once questioned its place in the future must now confront a reality where it is actively shaping. The landing of Chandrayaan-3 was, without question, a defining scientific moment for India. But beyond the data, the technology, and the orbit calculations, something even more profound was taking place. This mission wasn't only about touching the moon, it was about touching the soul of a nation. It was a statement that India, despite economic limitations and geopolitical challenges, can still achieve what many thought was out of reach. The successful landing wasn't simply a moment of triumph for Indian scientists. It was a collective elevation of national pride and identity. It was a signal that India's growth story isn't just happening on Earth. It's now written among the stars. In many ways, Chandrayaan-3 became more than a space mission. It became a national symbol. As millions watched the moment live, there was a unifying wave of emotion. People across class lines, regions, and ideologies were celebrating not just a scientific milestone, but something deeply personal. They were celebrating the idea that India, often underestimated by global powers, is more than capable of pioneering at the highest level. That pride didn't come from arrogance, it came from the hard-earned validation that global recognition often fails to provide. Science and technology usually move in quiet corridors, with minimal public attention, but in this case the entire country leaned in, because this success felt personal. It challenged an old narrative that had long plagued India on the global stage, a belief that real innovation, real breakthroughs, belonged only to the West. For generations, India was told that it could participate, but not lead. Chandrayaan-3 rewrote that message entirely. It proved that leadership doesn't depend on how loudly you speak, but on how clearly you act. The most remarkable thing was how India did it, with limited resources, no grand fanfare, and without trying to mimic anyone else's model. It was innovation born out of constraints, excellence forged through humility, and purpose shaped by vision. This wasn't about impressing the world, it was about achieving something meaningful, something that would inspire generations to come. The message was clear: a nation's worth is not measured by its past limitations, but by its present ambition and its future direction. The mission's success became a moment of reflection as well. It reminded the country of what it's capable of when unity, intelligence, and discipline come together. The scientists at ISRO didn't just land a spacecraft, they elevated a nation's spirit. They gave children in rural villages, young dreamers in crowded cities, and even skeptics a reason to believe in the impossible. Chandrayaan-3's success became a landmark not only in India's scientific history, but in its national consciousness. It was proof that the pursuit of knowledge can become a source of unity, identity, and pride. The rocket may have launched from Earth, but the energy it generated lifted far more than a spacecraft. It lifted an entire nation's belief in itself. India's Chandrayaan-3 mission represents a moment in history where poetic justice met scientific brilliance. For centuries, India was under colonial rule, its people subjugated, its resources drained, and its potential repeatedly dismissed. It was told what it could and could not achieve. Its identity was reshaped by others, and its narrative was written by those who believed they stood above. But with the soft landing of Chandrayaan-3 on the moon's south pole, something no other country had ever done, India answered, not with revenge, but with achievement. It didn't retaliate with bitterness, it rose with purpose. From being ruled to ruling the moon, it completed a circle that history had long denied it. This mission was never just about reaching the lunar surface. It was about reaching a place that once seemed unimaginable for a country burdened by the weight of colonization. The journey from colonial subjugation to celestial leadership is a testament to how far India has come, not just politically or economically, but in spirit and vision. Where once its contributions were taken and its intellect ignored, today its innovations light up the global stage, commanding attention without the need to shout. Chandrayaan-3 is the living embodiment of that transformation. There is something poetic in the fact that a former colony once deemed too poor, too chaotic, or too dependent to contribute meaningfully to science, has now done what others could not. The very powers that once governed India now look to it with a mixture of admiration and surprise. In the silent vastness of space, India spoke louder than any political speech ever could. The image of that tiny lander softly touching down on the moon said more about the strength of resilience than any written manifesto ever would. What makes this story even more powerful is the dignity with which India carries its success. There was no boastful triumphalism, no proclamations of superiority, just a quiet, proud celebration of progress. That grace, that humility stands in contrast to the colonial arrogance India once endured. It reflects a maturity, not only in science, but in national character. This was India telling its story its own way through hard work, discipline, and focus. The symbolism of this moment is undeniable. The moon, once a distant dream, is now a place where the Indian flag stands metaphorically planted, not in conquest, but in contribution. It's a victory not of empire but of effort. And for a country that was once exploited for the gains of others, contributing something to humanity's future feels not only just, it feels right. Chandrayaan-3 is more than a space mission. It is a message etched into the cosmos that India is no longer to be overlooked or underestimated. It is the moment where history nodded in acknowledgement of a nation that, once broken and controlled, rose without hate, conquered without war, and soared beyond earth without forgetting where it came from. That's not just justice. That's poetic. Here is a powerful conclusion for your entire speech, in Morgan Freeman's narration style. And so, as the dust settles on the moon's forgotten South Pole, one truth remains unshaken. India has arrived, not with fury, not with vengeance, but with quiet strength, steady hands, and a vision far greater than the limits history once placed upon it. In a world that once dictated who could dream and who must remain grounded, a former colony has now touched the stars, and the silence that follows from those who once judged says everything. This was not just a mission to the moon, it was a mission to reclaim dignity, rewrite the script, and remind the world that greatness is not inherited, it is earned. So let them write their headline. Let them search for words they once used to suppress. Because now the story writes itself, across craters, across galaxies, across time. Chandrayaan-3 was not just a spacecraft, it was a statement. And now the universe knows India's name.